This episode of Primitive Culture is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and to help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international programme of the non-profit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org. And if you want to join the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode, join the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field. We look forward to seeing you there.
This is Tim Russ, Lieutenant Commander Tuvok on Star Trek Voyager, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Open your mind to the past. Oh, this may mean something.
I've been coerced into watching tonight's movie.
You do have books in the 24th century.
It's a primitive culture. I'm just trying to blend in.
Some people think the future means the end of history. We haven't run out of history quite yet.
Hello and welcome to Primitive Culture, a Trek FM podcast all about our history, our culture and how Star Trek relates to it. I'm Duncan Barrett and today I'm joined by Tony Black. Hi Tony, how are you?
I'm pretty good, Duncan. I'm looking forward to part two, round two. Of our,
Picking up where we left off last time. We went nearly 2 hours, I think, on part one of this episode, or part one of this topic. So I don't think we're going to manage that a second time round. I kind of hope not. But we'll see what we manage to pull out of the back half of Picard season one. Certainly some pretty big, I would say, or at least one for me, very, very hefty influence that I think kind of comes into its own a bit in the second half of the season.
Yeah, you've totally jinxed it now, though. This is going to be a 3-hour podcast. You know, just brace yourselves, everyone.
Yeah, we'll see. Well, if it is, you're going to have to edit it down.
Yes.
So, you know.
Yeah, so it's in my best interest.
We'll see how we go. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, so last episode we talked a little bit about the first half of the season, from those kind of 3 pilot episodes through Absolute Candor and Stardust City Rag. I almost forgot the name, even though it's that episode is burned into my brain. This time around, we're looking at the kind of latter part of the season. Now, I don't know whether it makes sense necessarily to go episode by episode. I mean, I think absolutely we'll deal with the finale, the 2-part finale, as kind of one thing. The 3 that lead up to it, I mean, Nepenthe is a bit of an outlier, but I wonder if it makes more sense to sort of take it in terms of the plot that's being picked up there, which I think the big kind of plot that's really being developed is this plot with Soji and the Borg cube, I'd say, which is kind of, you know, threaded through the season as a whole. But Impossible Box and then Broken Pieces are the 2 episodes where I think that plot really comes to a head. And Nepenthe as well, because, you know, she has a lot of interesting stuff, Soji does, in Nepenthe, aside from all the, you know, kind of next-gen nostalgia that's going on there. But this is really the point where her story kind of comes to the fore. And I think for a lot of people, it's the point where that story started to work as well. I mean, I didn't mind the Borg cube sections in the earlier episodes, but I saw a lot of people online saying, oh God, you know, when are we going to get back to Picard? I don't care about these people on this Borg cube. Impossible Box was the one where I think they kind of sold it a little bit more. They sold that storyline, and partly by putting a bit of meat into it, really. It felt like everything up to that point was treading water to some extent.
It's strange looking back on it, actually, because you realise how much of a diversion it kind of takes over Absolute Candor and Stardust City Rag, and how it is, as we talked about in the last episode, you know, they are important episodes in gathering some of the pieces together of the characters and, you know, advancing certain, like the Maddox storyline. But at the same time, you could have really combined some of that and done it in a different way, and in a way you could almost skip to the end is the beginning to Impossible Box almost, and you could have worked it so you didn't necessarily have to go on those tangents. So it does feel like you have the first 3 episodes, you have a couple of little swerves around, and then you get to Impossible Box, and it kind of does that. It's almost like if you were going to brand the Picard as being part of a sort of a 90s TV series where you'd have the mythology episodes and you'd have episodes that forwarded the narrative. Impossible Box is that. It gets back to the core of the story, and by the end, they're in a different place than they were at the beginning. And that hadn't really happened since the first 3 episodes. It was treading water. It was spinning its wheels. And then this one, they're off at the races.
Suddenly it kind of kicks into gear. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one thing about the impossible box, I suppose, is there is literally an impossible box in it, which is effectively a kind of Romulan Rubik's Cube. I quite liked this. I mean, you know, just because we're looking for little references and so on. I love the kind of, I don't know what they were, I was going to say tarot cards, however you describe it, that kind of weird game thing.
Yeah.
Ramda, the auntie. Oh yeah, Auntie Ramda. Auntie Ramda was playing earlier on in the season, but particularly this kind of Rubik's Cube box really appealed to me. And I don't know. I generally speaking, I think both the show and also Una's book, which we mentioned last time, in particular, really done quite a lot at kind of giving us little glimpses into Romulan culture, which are kind of interesting. I love that thing about the door being round the side of the house, that no one has their front door at the front of their house. You know, these kind of little cultural insights, which I don't know if we could say they're necessarily borrowed. I mean, I have no idea if there is anywhere on Earth where a custom like that exists, but they to me, they have a kind of vaguely... There's a slight sort of Orientalist flavour to it, if you know what I mean. What it makes me think of, at least, is those maybe not actual sort of Chinese stories or whatever, but kind of European stories about the mysteries of the Far East. Do you know what I mean? There's a slight element there. And again, maybe with that ritual that Narek puts Soji through, something about the whole, you know, taking off your shoes and the way they walk around this room, it has a slight kind of sort of generalized Eastern feel to it, I suppose, which is interesting because it's not something that necessarily I would have associated with the Romulans before. Although on the other hand, you could say, you know, the Romulans as these Cold War enemies, this mysterious, you know, they are almost, I don't know, North Korea or something. Do you know what I mean? In that they have this kind of powerful empire, they have this kind of weaponry and so on, but actually we know very little about them. They're very secretive. They're very kind of closed off. So, you know, maybe that's something that's been there in Star Trek for a while, but it surprises me whenever we do get to see glimpses of that in the show, glimpses of this culture, whether it's in their games, whether it's in their, you know, architecture and house design, you know, whatever it is that we're kind of being fed on that.
Picard went into detail with this stuff, though, way more than any other show has. I mean, in the past, we've had the Romulans as, like you say, there is definitely a Far Eastern kind of aspect to them in that they were, you know, as we've said probably on this podcast before, that if the Klingons were the Russians, then the Romulans were the Chinese, you know, initially in the 60s. And in the 90s, it was a little bit less defined in that sense. But there was still that idea, I think, of that vaguely, like you say, Eastern aspect to them, that mystery, that enigma. But then on the one hand, they've got the architecture of ancient Rome, and they have this particularly empirical sort of Roman aspect to them, which is obviously where the whole name of them comes from. So they're a weird blend in a way of that kind of spanning kind of empire, and at the same time this very sort of closed off, isolationist, enigmatic culture. So Picard really cracks the window open on that, and it adds, like you say, like the card game, like Narek's ritual here, that it adds inflections that I don't think they contradict anything we've seen before with the Romulans, but they do deepen the culture. And I think if anything, they make them a little bit more of a mystical culture in this sense than they were before. You know, before I always just got the impression they were this, like you say, this cold power on the other side of like a space sort of iron curtain, and that they were, you know, very guarded about who they were and what their aims were, but they were essentially a very sort of nebulous, expansionist kind of empire that were frustrated by the Federation sort of being in their way. But this series has presented them as quite and whether it's just the Zat Vash aspect that we've seen in that it's this cult essentially, and that may not be representative of the entire culture, but from what we've seen, there is much more of a deliberately mystical aspects of their culture that is interested in prophecy and is interested in myth and legend than I think we've seen before. And that was one of them, with even though some of the Romulan stuff in this season wasn't particularly great, in my opinion, with some of the characters, I think that aspect I found really intriguing.
And in some ways, maybe it makes sense because we've seen the Vulcans, who are obviously the kind of cousins of the Romulans, have a lot of mysticism of their own, as much as they're very logical and rational and so on. They have all these kind of rituals and all these kind of I don't know. Again, there's that kind of mystery and that mysticism around them. And the Romulans we've seen in the past have been the military commanders kind of on the front lines, effectively, patrolling the border, doing that sort of thing. So we haven't seen that much of actual Romulan society one way or another, largely through the Romulans' choice that they don't want us to. I mean, even in Nemesis, there's kind of a bit of a sense of that, isn't it? That they're going to Romulus, they're going into the Romulan Senate and all this, and that being quite a big deal one way or another. I mean, I think it's interesting. I suppose Discovery has sort of reinvented the Klingons to some extent. Picard has kind of reinvented the Romulans. To me, the reinvention of the Romulans is more successful than the reinvention of the Klingons, or at least is more interesting to me. It appeals more to me. Maybe that's easier because we knew so little about them to begin with, even if some of the things we did know about them may seem to, in various ways contradict or slightly undermine some of the things we're learning about them here. Like there's that line that lots of people pointed to in The Defector, I think, where a Romulan says to Data, our cyberneticists would love to get their hands on you, and people were sort of saying, how do you reconcile that with this idea that on Romulus there is no such thing, which didn't particularly bother me. I mean, I guess you could say if there isn't any such, their cyberneticists are probably like Dr. Jurati, barely able to do anything, and therefore if an actual android comes along, that would kind of make sense. But generally speaking, I think for me the kind of Romulan stuff worked well, and it didn't seem to contradict anything that we previously knew about them from Star Trek, despite the fact that we had seen a fair amount of a certain aspect of Romulan society. And it certainly gave a hint of a kind of a much greater depth sort of beneath the surface than maybe we'd ever glimpsed before.
Yeah, absolutely.
No Remans, though.
No, yeah, still no Remans. But I think that line about the...
We're waiting for season 2 on that.
I think we'll be waiting a long time. That those cyberneticists, that cyberneticist line from The Defector is one of those things where I think you've got to be a real stickler for canon and for continuity, completely making sense across all Star Trek for that to really leap out. And it's one of those things where, I've said before on this podcast, I love continuity as much as the next man. I really do. But you're talking about a line that was written 30 years ago in an episode that it was by a completely different staff at a completely different era. And I think you've got to be beholden to what is actually a really interesting idea, even if necessarily the execution of this whole thing hasn't been perfect. The idea of what they wanted to do with the Romulans here was great. It was different. It was unique. It was quite interesting. So to be turning around and saying, for Michael Chabon and everyone to turn around and go, no, we can't do that because of a line in episode 10 of season 3 of Next Generation is exactly where canon can become limiting. So I'm glad they didn't really hold to that, and they went into this, and whether in the end, a little bit, the Zat Vash sort of falls apart into nothing. The fact they attempted to explore Romulan culture like this, all power to them. And I think, like you, I think it works. I think I think unlike the Klingon reinvention, which did have interesting ideas in Discovery about, fundamentalism and warring different tribes and things like that, I think it wasn't as well thought through. So by the time that all came to a head, it felt a little bit like it was multiple different ideas clashing. Whereas with this, it feels like they thought through everything they wanted to do with the Romulans from the beginning to the end of this season. So, yeah, it worked for me.
If anything, I was a bit disappointed that as the season went on, I felt like we were learning less about them. I suppose after the Impossible Box, we don't really learn anything new about the Romulans, which is one reason maybe why this is a good episode to focus that sort of element on. It just struck me, as well as the Impossible Box, obviously referring to that kind of Rubik's Cube-like toy, it's almost also refers to that room that Soji is put in where she goes through that test is almost like a kind of version of that itself, insofar as, it's a cube within a cube within a cube. I mean, you could say the Borg cube is kind of almost a Rubik's Cube mystery of its own. I saw someone online when that episode came out commenting that maybe it was rather risque to write an episode all about this guy trying to get to the depths of this woman he was sleeping with and calling it the Impossible Box. So, there's kind of another element of Soji is not only the little girl that, the kind of ballerina figure that pops up when you solve the puzzle, but, on a less crude level, it's, she is sort of the mystery that has to be disassembled or taken apart or kind of solved one way or another by, whether by Narek or by her. And I think they do sort of play with that insofar as, in this dream, she sees herself as not quite an automaton. She sees herself as a kind of a mannequin, like an artist's mannequin effectively, but you know, again, this kind of old-fashioned wooden object. There's something there in these kind of mysterious material objects somehow that's transferring across.
Yeah, I think that's true, really, and I think it's again, it's, you know, I'll give them credit for titles in that they tried to put across titles that had layered meanings, and I think by and large, for a fair few of these titles. And, you know, we talked last week about we were trying to decrypt Stardust City Rag, and we still quite haven't really. This one's a little bit easier to sort of latch onto. So, yeah, I think it works on those levels.
Now, let's talk about what I think is probably the single biggest influence on this season overall. And it's a film which I know we have wildly diverging opinions on. This film is probably my favourite film of all time. And I know that, Tony, you can't stand it. So we may have interesting different opinions on the ways in which it's influenced this season of Picard. But the film is Blade Runner. And I think the more that you go back and watch these two things side by side, the more the parallels between them come to the fore. I mean, it struck me even watching the pilot, even watching the first episode, Remembrance, that Darge in that storyline brings Blade Runner to mind because of this key idea that comes up in Blade Runner of the android that doesn't know that it's an android, basically. I mean, for anyone who isn't familiar with Blade Runner, first of all, ignore anything Tony's about to say, go away and watch it. You know, it's mind-blowing and amazing. But the core kind of philosophical problem of that film, I guess, is the idea that they have these replicants, these androids that know that they're androids and that have kind of gone rogue. They're effectively the rogue synths, and they've come back to Earth from Mars, I think. And certainly they're being used on Mars. They've come back and they're causing trouble and killing people and so on. And they have to be retired in the parlance of the film, basically killed by the Blade Runner, played by Harrison Ford. But quite early on in the story, he encounters a sort of femme fatale character, this woman, Rachel, who he discovers is actually a replicant but doesn't realise it. And he kind of, you know, reveals to her essentially that this is the case. But there's this core question which he asks someone else in the film. He says, how can it not know what it is? And that's the kind of real quandary of the sort of philosophical quandary of the film, is this idea that you might be an android and not know it, to the point where the film itself ends on this kind of question mark around whether Deckard might himself be a replicant. And there are kind of clues that he is, particularly in the director's cut of the film. Apparently, interestingly, no one in England or America picked up on this in the director's cut, but when they screened the original cut for French audiences, they all came out of the cinema saying, oh, it's obvious he's a replicant anyway, even without this kind of extra stuff being chucked in to put that in the viewer's minds. And it's a question that goes back to the novel as well that the book is based on. It's based on a novel by Philip K. Dick called Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? And in that, there's quite explicit, there's another Blade Runner character who is in fact a replicant, not Deckard, not the character played by Harrison Ford in the film. But there is a lot of discussion back and forth about whether Deckard might be a replicant, whether someone who basically goes around killing these effectively sentient androids has to effectively be a bit of a psychopath themselves, you know, almost by definition. So this is the core question, I suppose. And as soon as you get a character like Darge in Remembrance, who is an android and doesn't realise she's an android and has to go through that process of understanding that and working out what that might mean, that kind of threw up massive Blade Runner sort of flares for me. I mean, we've seen it in Star Trek before with Juliana Taylor in Inheritance. They kind of did a riff on that idea. But I think that's really only the beginning of it. And as you watch going through the season, the way they develop that story, we almost have the kind of dumb show version with Darge, and then we get the kind of real meat of it with Soji, where that realization and the processing of that is much more drawn out. The kind of Blade Runner parallels again sort of keep coming to the fore.
Okay, so not that this is going to be of massive interest to many people, I imagine, but let me just clarify something. I wouldn't say I hate Blade Runner. I'd say that I find it quite tedious and dull in terms of, and I've tried about 3 or 4 different times. I've tried both different cuts and I still find it quite dull. Now, it's personal taste. I think I can definitely appreciate that it's a beautiful looking film. It's very impressive. It's seminal in terms of the science fiction genre, you know, at the start of the 80s and what it's inspired over the years, you know. So I absolutely understand why most people love this film to bits like yourself, Duncan. And I want to get there one day. And so hopefully I will. But I think, for me, I think the ideas in it are a bit more interesting than the execution of it ultimately. You know, what the things you've just talked about are fascinating. And I mentioned last week how much I've felt like Picard has been playing in a similar wheelhouse as Westworld, the TV series. And Westworld, absolutely, that was based on a movie in the 70s, but that absolutely is taking a cue from this very similar idea about, you know, what is real, what isn't. You know, in this case, they're called hosts, but they're androids. They're the same thing. So they're all playing with this similar idea of who am I, what am I. And I think with Soji in this season, there is a lot else. It can't really get into that in the depth that something like Westworld would, because that has the space really to kind of, even though there's a lot going on, it does have the space to explore the philosophical idea behind it a little bit more than Picard does, because Picard has got to service a lot of other stuff. But I think it is there in this season with Soji. And once she starts to really understand, and the Impossible Box is that episode really where it starts to unlock, you know, and she starts to really understand who or what she is. And then Nepenthe is her trying to adjust and come to terms with that a bit more as he's broken pieces in the rest of the season. But yeah, I think Blade Runner is a good comparison. It's a good touchstone for this, and I think it's something that ultimately in future seasons, I imagine that they might do with Soji a similar story that they did in a way with Data, but just updated for the modern day. Because the mystery is gone now. We know what she is. We know where she came from. So they can play out a different kind of thing, I think, with her now, potentially, in season 2. But I think in this, the fact that that's all part of the mystery is an interesting and definitely a very Blade Runner-esque kind of thing. It just doesn't have the ambiguity. Like you say, at the end of Blade Runner, that is one of the great movie moments. You know, is Deckard a replicant? You don't quite get that at the end of Picard. Is Soji an android or not? We know she is. So it would have been almost quite nice if they'd done a similar story like that, where you weren't sure and that she wasn't sure at the end of it. The only thing I really felt was ultimately a bit of a false note, and I don't know what you think about this, is the idea that she's Data's daughter. I don't really think that's true, really. I think it's a reach to sort of assume that she's Data's daughter. Yes, she has the same kind of positronic neuron, and she was built from his template, essentially. But can you really, you know, in my head, Lal was, in The Offspring, was Data's daughter, or a daughter of Data. I feel like she's more, you know, part of the Sung family, if you like, as opposed to being the daughter of Data. So that was a bit of a false note for me, really.
Yeah, I totally understand that. I mean, she's Data's daughter. I think we have to understand she's Data's daughter in the sense that she is made from a part of Data. But then it kind of raises the question, okay, so she looks like the character that Data painted 30 years earlier or whatever. And that suggests that, so Maddox and Sung obviously created a body for her that matched that painting. She wasn't the first, as far as we know, android that they... Well, maybe she was. Maybe they made her before they made that Saga, the English one, basically. I mean, you know, there are other models of androids that don't look like anything painted by Data, as far as we know. But I think it's more that the show wants us to see her as Data's daughter and to kind of use that to get at this question of what does Data mean to Picard. And, you know, you've got that beautiful scene in Broken Pieces where they're talking about Picard's love for Data and, as it turns out, Data's love for Picard. And you can kind of only... Well, I don't know if you can only do that if you set her up as his daughter, but that's kind of hinging on the idea that she's family. And I suppose, again, in Nepenthe as well, Riker and Troy are kind of... I'm sure they'd be welcoming to her anyway, but they're sort of particularly welcoming to her because they recognise her as almost a part of their extended family somehow. And that whole side of it, I suppose, is a side that is not in the kind of Blade Runner mould at all, insofar as that's much more, you know, when you say it doesn't end on, I mean, Blade Runner famously ends on this is a spoiler, obviously, if you're going to go and see it. But the key thing that makes Deckard in the film think that he might be a replicant is the fact that he's been having this dream about a unicorn. And then this mysterious policeman, played by Edward James Olmos from Battlestar Galactica in later years, leaves this little... He's been making these origami creatures all throughout the film, and he leaves a little unicorn for him, which kind of, you know, hints at the idea that he that his dream is a sort of, has been implanted in the same way as Rachel has these memories that are not her memories, and that she's sort of trying to work out, well, where does the programming end and I begin, essentially. And then the film ends with this very dramatic music and a door slamming, and it's just a very kind of, it's like this final revelation right at the last minute. It's very, as you say, it's a great moment. It's very well handled. It's very un-Star Trek. I mean, Star Trek wouldn't do that kind of thing, I don't think, really. Star Trek has to go in a more optimistic direction. It has to go in a more kind of, I was going to say cuddly, but you know,
yeah.
There is an element of that friendship and camaraderie and family and all these sort of things. Whereas Blade Runner ends with them basically on the run and disappearing. I don't know. I haven't seen the sequel yet, so don't tell me. Obviously, I assume he wasn't a replicant, because if he was, then he wouldn't still be around.
I'm not saying anything. But, you got to watch it.
I love the original so much that I struggle with the idea of there being a sequel to that film. But I hear good things about it. But I think this idea of not just borrowing from Blade Runner in terms of this central idea of the replicant who doesn't know she's a replicant, but also the fact that she's in this relationship, this quite strange relationship with someone who is effectively a replicant. I mean, Narek is effectively a Blade Runner. His job is to kill androids, and Narissa as well. They're basically a pair of Blade Runners, effectively, in those terms. He's having this weird kind of twisted relationship with Soji, where he's gaslighting her. He's pretending. That's one of the things I think is the most uncomfortable about it. I mean, first of all, obviously he's sleeping with her under false pretenses and so on, and doing all this stuff to use her. But he's also, the thing I find the most creepy about it is the way he's sort of saying, oh, there's something weird about this. I've noticed that you always speak to your mother for the exact same amount of time. He's playing this sort of innocent, curious person, investigating her to kind of nudge her in this direction. It's really unpleasant. And they call her, Raffi refers to Narek as the abusive boyfriend at one point. So there's definitely a sense of he's, it's not just, as they talk about in Nepenthe, they talk about, is she being tortured? Is her sense of reality being undermined? A bit like we had with Picard and his four lights or whatever. But there's also the fact that this is in the context of a relationship. She thinks he's in love with her. He is this sort of ultimate abusive boyfriend in a way. Now, in Blade Runner, you have this weird relationship between Deckard and Rachel where it's sort of romantic. It's kind of, she's sort of this femme fatale figure. She's sort of the romance of the film. There's also a scene where he comes off as kind of a quasi-rapist, really, in the way that there's this weird scene where he's sort of, does she want to go? Does she want to be with him or not? It's all the kind of power dynamics and all the stuff around it is very uncomfortable. And there's, I suppose, this sense that is she just this machine to be used, or is she a person with her own rights? Do you know what I mean? And I guess that sense of like treating a person as an object. Obviously, if the person is an android, are you treating it sort of raises all these different questions. I don't know if you watched the TV series Humans, but that kind of went into that a lot with these, in particular, this idea of, these people having sex with their androids who turned out to be sentient, or these kind of basically sort of prostitute androids. And in the movie Blade Runner, again, some of the replicants that Deckard is going to hunt down are what they call pleasure models that are sent off for the soldiers or whoever it is to sleep with, effectively. So there is this kind of weird link, I suppose, between sex and power and violence and all these sort of things. And it just strikes me that this story is never done. It is done to an extent with Deckard. There's this kind of question mark over Deckard, but this story of someone realizing they're not who they thought they were, that they're not human, seems to be one that's always pinned on a kind of youngish woman. And I don't know, what that is saying. Is it saying that, the character who on some fundamental level doesn't know who they are always ends up being this sort of ingenue, or maybe not an ingenue in the case of Blade Runner, but, a young woman. And in the book of, in Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, again, the character of Rachel is described as being very young. She's slightly less. The woman in the film, she's got a slightly kind of vampy quality with her hair and everything. So I think that kind of casts her slightly differently. But in the book, she's very much young, lithe, compared to even all the other replicants. This sort of sense of her youth is accentuated. So again, there's a kind of, I don't know, almost a level of innocence to it. But then we find out that actually she's an active member of this sort of cell of, sort of nefarious replicants. But her job is to seduce the Blade Runners and sleep with them. So she is this kind of femme fatale, after all. And I suppose that's the sort of question for Narek, maybe. And his sister is encouraging him to see Soji as a monster, to see her as a thing, to see her as the enemy. You know, she says at one point, are you sure that you're not, that she's not playing you, basically? Are you sure that you're the one controlling this situation? Because they can't help seeing her as this sort of diabolical, evil force, essentially. Whereas I suppose we're seeing her as this quite vulnerable, innocent, you know, particularly, as I say, again, when we get to Nepenthe, we sort of see the ramifications of this discovery for her and how difficult it is to process emotionally. You know, we see her very much as the victim. They see her as the enemy.
Yeah, and I think part of the reason that I think Nerissa and Narek are the weakest link in this entire season is that they don't get a Nepenthe in the sense that Soji gets that episode in which she can start coming to terms and discuss that and think about that and actually, you know, decrypt it almost and process it. Whereas there's no equivalent sort of episode or real proper moment, bar one or two flickers, where Nerissa or Narek are truly characterized over why they're doing what they're doing. You know, you get a scene with Nerissa and Ramda where you find out she's their aunt, and there's a little bit there. You see in flashback that in Broken Pieces that Nerissa was there when they found the admonition and all this kind of stuff. She had the vision and stuff like that. And probably the most telling scene in terms of Narek's psychology is in the finale part 1, where he tells the myth of the Destroyer to the others, to Raffi and Rios and co. But it all feels a little bit like you spend a lot of the season trying to, everything's so mysterious, and what they're doing is so mysterious that they struggle really to properly characterize them as people with motivations, interesting and logical motivations for me. So you don't get the flip side of it. Narek is just the abusive creep, basically, and there are lines or there are moments that try and explain some of the behaviour, you know, and it feels like towards the end of the season they're almost trying to paint Narek as being a possible redemptive character who could be, it might, if not the hero, then somebody. You know, I mean, Nerissa's I think they pretty much guess that she's beyond hope, basically, so that's why they kill her off. But they feel like maybe Narek isn't. But like you say, he is grooming Soji essentially in many ways. And that is a bitter pill to swallow, particularly when you don't really understand beyond some, you know, myth why they would go down this road and why they do it. So I think that was a bit of a problem in terms of really selling the idea, and this what could have been quite a complicated exploration of that kind of sexual manipulation that goes on, you know, in the real world, especially, you know, and is more highlighted in this day and age among society. But it can't really get there, and it's more focused on the mystery behind what Soji might do. And I feel like it misses a little beat there, to be honest. And it could have got into that more.
It's hard to know though, because I remember, you know, as we were approaching the end of the season, some people online were sort of saying, God, I hope we don't get a redemptive arc for Narek. Basically, he's beyond the pale. I don't want to see him redeemed. You know, I don't care if he feels guilty about it. He's just a despicable character. And I think it is interesting, you know, yes, in a sort of post-Me Too world, maybe there are elements of that storyline that get highlighted that otherwise wouldn't be. I mean, I think absolutely the kind of Blade Runner parallels between Narek and Deckard are there, insofar as Deckard is notionally the hero of the story, but there are reasons why those French audiences felt that he was essentially inhuman himself, because there's a kind of cruelty to him, there's a kind of callous side to him. I mean, okay, his job is going out and killing people, so he's a bounty hunter. There's violence is sort of baked into it, but he can be and Harrison Ford is brilliant, I think, in that role. He has a kind of casual cruelty to him, particularly, for example, there's the scene in The Impossible Box, where Soji is, you know, carbon dating or whatever she's doing, all her belongings, and going through all these old photos and so on. Again, is kind of lifted straight out of Blade Runner, in that there's this whole thing about all these old photos that Rachel has and the memories that she has, and she's sort of trying to cling on to this and sort of saying, you know, where has all this come from or whatever. And Deckard in this quite cruel way, sort of recites a load of memories that he knows that she's been given that actually aren't her memories. They're actually the guy who runs the company that makes the androids' niece's memories, including one which again has a sort of vaguely sexual thing, which is about when she was a child and, you know, she and her brother were playing doctors and nurses or something. And there's this kind of humiliation somehow in the way that he knows all of this and he just recites it back at her. And she is in tears and really, you know, it's a complete kind of moment of breakdown in a way. And then he sort of tries to brush it aside and says, oh, it's just a bad joke. He, you know, tries to sort of say, I didn't mean it, I didn't say any of that. But at the same time, there is this kind of sense of cruelty. There is this kind of sense of, there is something abusive to that character, I would say. Not as obviously, not in this kind of explicit, in this sort of Me Too, post-Me Too way that we might understand Narek. But, you know, ultimately, both Deckard and Narek are faced with the same mission. I mean, Deckard's job is to retire to kill Rachel. She's one of the ones on his list. Narek is essentially supposed to be killing Soji, and indeed he does try to kill her. At the end of Blade Runner, I suppose there is an element of redemption because Deckard doesn't kill her. He runs off with her. So he sort of ultimately is redeemed, I suppose. Ultimately, he kind of makes that decision. Narek, we don't really see that. All we see is that moment where he kills her, as he thinks, and then is obviously distraught and has tears running down his face and so on. So it's kind of I think it's kind of an interesting choice in a way that we don't get a clear redemptive arc. Yeah, he sort of teams up with our heroes towards the end, but again, he sort of is carrying on being pretty shady and sort of despicable and a bit of a dubious character. And of course, we don't ever really find out what happens to him. I mean, various people sort of saying what happened. They kind of dropped the ball with Narek because they never included anything in that finale. Does he go off with the Romulan fleet? Does he get sent over, you know, to Starfleet arrest him? What happens to him? Because they kind of forget to tell us where he ended up, which I suppose leaves open the possibility he might come back in one way or another. And there's certainly no reconciliation with Soji. You know, there's no wrapping up of that storyline. She's kind of, yeah, he's the ex that is well out of her life by that point, you know.
I did hear that there might have been a scene written, or a plan at least, to explain that Narek was handed over to Starfleet. But I think they either didn't film it or they deleted it. I think and presumably it would have happened around the time that, you know, Riker shows up with all the fleet and stuff. Maybe they just thought it was a bit, you know, at that point where you're supposed to be invested in Picard's possible death, just cutting to Narek, boarding the shuttle or whatever is just a bit anticlimactic. But I think, yeah, he could well appear again, and they do something about him having to come to terms with what he did to Soji. That could be an interesting storyline, really, in that, you know, in season 2, if they actually play a beat of her actually struggling to, you know, connect with people, or particularly men, because of how he tricked her, that would be interesting. That would be very interesting to see play out, actually. But it depends whether they're going to go down that road. But I think the whole idea of like you say, these Blade Runner connections and the ideas around. I found that very interesting what you said about the fact that they are often females. I think there is definitely something to that. You know, when you look at, again, to use Westworld as another comparison, because it plays in these similar beats, the two main characters in Westworld are both women, and they both are reacting to this realization that they've been abused, like by people who come to this park, who come there and use them for sex as part of the game that they're playing, or kill them brutally, or, you know, all these terrible things. And they become self-aware of this horror that these humans are considering is just part of the game, you know, a live action theme park, but they consider themselves sentient beings who have got all these traumatic memories, and how they react to that is going down different paths. So maybe it's something about how it's maybe more harrowing to see this kind of thing happen to a woman than it would be to a man. And you wouldn't be able to necessarily play the same beat. You know, hypothetically, had it been two male androids who didn't know they were androids as opposed to female characters, and Narissa was playing the Narek role, would it have been the same kind of story? You know, would it have been seen in the same way? I mean, that's an interesting thing to consider, actually. You know, would it have changed the complexion of this entire idea?
And who would have written it that way? Because, you see, I sort of wonder whether there's an element of, almost unconsciously, is it a male writer's perspective that thinks of a woman as an impossible box that has to be solved and that is mysterious and that kind of is somehow unknowable and doesn't even know itself. Do you know what I mean? Is there something about our kind of ideas of masculinity that don't really allow scope for that in the same way? Not to say it's not possible, but that we sort of push towards the woman being in that situation. And it almost calls to mind something like Freud's hysterics. You know, Freud's kind of interest in the mysteries of women's unconscious in particular, and hysteria and kind of all these sorts of things. And the test that Narek puts Soji through, that ritual, it has the element of a kind of psychoanalytic, therapeutic environment in a way. But it also links it, interestingly, again, going back to Blade Runner, to this test that Deckard performs, the Voight-Kampff test, which is basically an empathy test, which they use on the androids to find out whether they're human, to use it on the suspected androids to find out whether they're human or not. And so when Narek asks Soji, how does it make you feel when your father doesn't respond? That almost sound, I mean, it sounds like a counsellor. It sounds like counsellor speak. You know, that's exactly what you'd expect a counsellor to ask their, patient, essentially. But it's also very much in line with these kind of probing emotive questions that you get in the Voight-Kampff test, which are all about, interestingly, in Blade Runner, both the film and the book that it's based on, the world. And this, I think, in some ways is made much clearer in the book. In the film, it maybe is slightly ambiguous what it's all about, but a lot of these questions are about the treatment of animals, which again, you could say is an interesting, if you're interested in, animal rights and the objectification of animals and, whether you treat animals or robots or whatever it is as essentially different kinds of people or essentially different kinds of objects. But in the world that those stories take place in, most, in fact, animals have become extinct or died out or incredibly rare, and therefore they're kind of prized, and they're, people presumably don't eat them. They don't, any kind of use of animals basically is seen as morally appalling, really. And so the Blade Runners that are testing the suspected androids, because the androids don't have empathy for animals, whereas the humans do have empathy for animals, supposedly. So there's this test, that they perform where they ask all these questions like, you find a turtle that's flipped on its back and it's dying in the sun. Do you help the turtle out or whatever? But interestingly, what they're doing is that and this is another big link to the Picard series. A lot of people were complaining as this series went on. When we got to, for example, the scene with Icheb that annoyed everyone, it was just one example, and then it came up again in the finale of these eyes being ripped out and so on. And various people were saying, what is wrong with the writers of this show? Why are they so obsessed with eyes? What's all this hideous eye imagery doing in my Star Trek show? There's something really sick and weird and twisted about it. Well, that again comes directly from Blade Runner, because Blade Runner is totally, the eye is the kind of key motif almost of that film. The Voight-Kampff test works by focusing in on the eye and studying the eye in great detail. There are all these scenes. For example, there's a scene where the replicants go and find the man who created their eyes, and one of them is like pulling these eyes out of this sort of goo and playing around with them and so on. Tyrell, the guy who's the kind of creator of all the replicants, that they go back to effectively, they initially want to find out if they can live for longer, because their deal is that their life is limited to 4 years, which again ties into this idea of a brief existence. We see this in the end with Data saying that the butterfly that lives forever isn't a butterfly, and this kind of evanescence and this sort of temporary aspect of life. The replicants have this very short lifespan and they want to live longer, so they go back to see the creator. He says it's not possible, and he's killed again by gouging him through the eyes. So this kind of and then famously, I mean, in Picard we have Spot 2. In Blade Runner, we have, because of this whole thing about animals, we have this owl, which again is one of the kind of iconic images of the film. And this owl with these kind of glassy, almost sort of dead eyes. The owl turns out to be not a real owl, but a synthetic owl. So again, the film is kind of constantly fixated on eyes one way or another. I suppose this idea of the eyes as the window to the soul. Yeah. So I think anyone who's sort of complaining, Michael Chabon and the writers of Picard have got this sort of unhealthy eye fetish, should recognise that it's not coming out of nowhere. This isn't the kind of random thing. This is, precisely because they're lifting so much of, and not just the story in terms of Soji, but also the styling. I mean, I talked last time about the Dixon Hill element, that kind of noirist stuff, but again, the kind of techno-noir stuff that we sort of get a glimpse of with Daj in that first episode, again, very much kind of calls to mind Blade Runner, which is basically a sort of sci-fi noir film. So again, I would say, if of anything that we might talk about in these 2 episodes, this is the one that really is the key influence on this, running through this entire season from beginning to end.
Yeah, and I mean, it'll be one of those things I think that some people pick up on and others don't if you've seen Blade Runner or not. But it's definitely worth, I'd say, going back. You made me want to go and, if anything, this will make me go and watch Blade Runner again, actually.
You're going to watch it a 4th time and see if you can make it through.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it gives me another reason to do it. So I would encourage anyone
one
to
day.
check that out. Yeah, I'll get there.
Definitely watch the director's cut or the final cut or whatever it is. Don't watch the original cut is the one with the slightly ropey voiceover from Harrison Ford, which he didn't want to do. You can tell he's phoning it in. It kind of it's not as good. I mean, it's still a beautiful film, but it definitely the director's cut and the kind of the later cuts improve on it and make it a more interesting film. It is a weird one. I mean, I love that film. Despite that, I have fallen asleep watching that film. I mean, mainly because I've put it on at 10 o'clock at night, with a beer or two or whatever. But it has a weirdly sort of languid pace, and yet the plot is actually in other ways kind of quite fast. You do sort of have to keep up with the plot, but at the same time give in to the mood, which is there is something strangely hypnotic about it. But definitely, I would say, well worth watching if you haven't seen it in its own right, and definitely interesting as a kind of complement to season 1 of Picard. So before we move on, Tony, any other mysteries in the Impossible Box that you want to draw out before we move on from that episode?
Well, one that is slightly connected to Soji, actually, which was there was a moment where you see a lunchbox in her room that was a memento from her childhood, which, it was a false memory implanted ultimately, but it was featuring a character called Flutter. And this was another callback to Voyager. There've been a few. In this episode, there was also the callback to Prime Factors, wasn't there, with the Sicarians and their super warpy technology that they use on the Borg cube. But the Adventures of Flutter were a series of holoprograms that appeared in the episode Once Upon a Time in, I think, the 6th season of Voyager, which was something that Naomi Wildman enjoyed, the young girl on Voyager, who we saw regularly. And her mother used them, Samantha Wildman, who was one of the crewmen as well, who'd pop up from time to time. So, and that was a few decades before. So Flutter what interests me about this is that, it's a fairly, blink and you'll miss it callback to Voyager. But I think what's interesting in referencing Flutter is that it sort of suggests the idea that popular culture is still alive and well in the 24th century. And that, because that's something that you don't always get in Star Trek necessarily, in that, and I suppose it's difficult to pull off in that all of the characters throughout Star Trek always have interests that either go back to the 20th century or further, beyond. Their cultural reference points and their pop culture things are based on things we understand. You never get them. You very rarely, you'll get the odd mention of like a 22nd century opera singer or whatever, but you never really get the sense that they are venerated in like the Beatles are, in the future or whatever. So it's hard for them, I suppose, to do that without creating a whole sort of backstory for a fictional future, movie or TV show or character or whatever. But Flutter's a good example of how they do that, and they work that into a story, and that you have young children consistently entertained by this sort of, I think the idea of it was that it was sort of like a detective sort of character who would help kids understand deductive reasoning in like a magical sort of land. The Forest of Forever, it was called. And Flutter, you'd have Flutter stories called Flutter and the Tree Monster, Flutter and the Perfect Day, Flutter meets the Invincible Invertebrates. So there's lots of nice, fun little stories that you could imagine being analogous to cartoons in our modern day, or certain, popular books, that kids like Harry Potter that kids read, and digest and enjoy. So I just liked that, even though it was probably something that Kirsten Beyer pulled back, from the Voyager days and just threw in there. But it intrigues me the idea that there is 24th century pop culture, and that there are potentially these kind of characters in the way that we venerate Star Trek characters and this world in that future as well.
It fascinates me as well as a parent of a small child, because it kind of makes me wonder, is Flutter in Voyager a new thing? Has Flutter been around for hundreds of years? I mean, is Flutter the equivalent of like Enid Blyton, or is Flutter the equivalent of the Teletubbies? Do you know what I mean? And I suppose Soji, okay, it's whatever, we're several decades on from that iteration of Star Trek. But I suppose if Soji's in her early 20s, I don't know how old Naomi Wildman would be, probably a similar-ish age, right? So, maybe they would have grown up with the same, I don't know, though Naomi aged at a weird rate, didn't she? So who knows? But I mean, is having a Flutter lunchbox or pencil case or whatever it is kind of nostalgic in the way that if I had a rainbow lunchbox or something, it would be for me? Or is Flutter what Raffi's grandson or granddaughter is going to be growing up with as well?
Well, I mean, I think the suggestion in Voyager was that Samantha Wildman had enjoyed them when she was a child. So you're talking about that.
You're right. Yes,
that
you're right.
Flutter's been around for. So when's Voyager take place? That's the early 2370s. So Flutter has potentially been around for 20, 30 years before then. So it might have been something that cropped up in the mid 24th century and is still popular 50 years on. So in that sense, that does make it analogous to maybe something like My Little Pony, which has been around for decades, in our world.
Or I was going to say, is Flutter the sooty of the 24th century?
Maybe, yeah.
Comes back in a new form, but for every generation. Yeah, could be. Well, it's an interesting point. And I mean, it is interesting. We've seen, we've always seen kids in Star Trek, I suppose, but I think we've seen more toys recently. I mean, we saw in the Short Trek cartoon with the young Michael Burnham, she had a tardigrade toy, which I thought was a bit of a stretch. It seems a bit unlikely that she happens to have had a tardigrade toy as a child when she's going to encounter one that's so significant later on. But kind of interesting that we get to see these kids' toys. And also, Soji has a glommer, I think. Someone else pointed out, someone else who'd been scouring the background of those scenes. And the glommer that she has is the exact same glommer toy that they've been selling, based off the animated series, which I bought one of for my son back at Destination Star Trek 2018. And he still plays with. It comes with a couple of baby tribbles that you can stick inside its stomach and close up. So, not only is Flutter surviving, but, CBS marketing circa, whenever they started making those glommer toys, is also thriving well into the 24th century. Clearly.
Well, I've also got a tribble. I got one in 2016 Destination Star Trek. I bought a tribble. I named him Marvin, and every now and then I just I go, hi Marvin, and I tap him, and he goes, and he's still there.
Very nice.
I can see him right now. Yeah. But everyone needs a tribble, in my opinion. But there you go.
They do, absolutely. Well, moving from nostalgia onto something sort of slightly different, I suppose. I mean, the episode Nepenthe is very much an episode about nostalgia, one way or another. But the word Nepenthe I thought was kind of interesting. I had to go and look this one up, but it's another classical reference. Quite a lot of classical references in this season of Picard, as well as, typically with Star Trek, we're used to a lot of Shakespearean references in particular. Maybe not so much from kind of the classical world. It feels like there's a bit more of a feed into things here. Certainly when we get to the end of the season, we're going to, talk about those final episodes, which again have a kind of classical ring to them in the title and also in the styling to some extent. But Nepenthe being a drug of forgetfulness. So there's obviously a kind of strong association here being made with the idea that the Troy Rikers, they've moved to this planet to heal, to forget, to kind of move past their suffering. One way or another. Now, interestingly, the planet that Icheb was killed on is called Vergessen, and Vergessen apparently is also is the German in this instance for to forget. So weirdly, we've got these two quite striking named planets that are named. They're not, Cestus 3 or whatever it is, Omicron Theta, or they're not these kind of sci-fi sounding names. They're these planets that are named after, after a cultural legacy, one way or another. One of them referencing something in classical antiquity, one of them referencing German. And the Vergessen is in the Hypatia system. So again, there's a kind of classical reference there. Hypatia being an ancient Greek mathematician and scientist who was murdered by a Christian mob. So I don't know if this is where we really do need Chrissy from the line to fill us in. I think this is not my territory at all, but I think it's interesting that the show keeps kind of bringing up these associations, even if it's just in the naming of a planet or something, and again sort of grounding it in our own history and our own culture and our own world to some extent. Although I think a lot of people, when at the end of The Impossible Box, when Picard says send us to Nepenthe, and it was all in this kind of rather a lot of drama and noise and stuff going on, a lot of people thought they were ending up in the Klingon gulag. And it's a good job that Hugh heard him correctly, and sent him to the right planet, because otherwise that could have been a whole different episode.
That would have been a fascinating alternate idea, wouldn't it? Yeah, he bumps into
when you get, exactly, you kind of dial the wrong number on the Sicarian whatever it is, machine. Anything else that you wanted to talk about from Nepenthe?
Well, I suppose I'm interested really in particularly. Well, I suppose there's a couple of things. Firstly, Kestra Troy Riker and her her world, the world building she does in the language she creates and the stories that she builds that are based on her deceased brother's ideas, and that he created his own kind of very Tolkien-esque language. This very much felt like a play on Tolkien and Lord of the Rings and that kind of. Well, and I suppose to some extent the way that the Mark Cochran, built up the Klingon language in the Star Trek universe. The idea that there are, and again, I suppose it's a bit similar to the reference to Flutter, that the idea that you have characters in this future who are, building mythical worlds and are escaping into a form of, their own kind of entertainment, and like at one point, Kestra talks in another language, and Deanna says that it's Harpanthe, spoken by the mind witches of the southern ice, which sounds like something out of Game of Thrones, and George R.R. Martin. But it's great. I think that's a nice add. I mean, it adds something to Kestra as a character, and she's a great character anyway. She's really well characterized in that one episode. But it adds a level of sadness in that it's sort of been constructed off the back of the person they've lost, their brother and their son. But also, it just adds a nice dimension to the character of Kestra, I think, and gives her a real level of individuality that some characters might be missing, as well as like we say, touching on these ideas of these, very large scale ideas of world building that you've seen in literature in the past.
Absolutely. I mean, interesting. Yeah, you should pick up the fantasy element. I think that is definitely there, and you're right. I mean, Tolkien we've got already with the kind of character of Elnor, so it's almost a parallel there. I sort of saw her more as this kind of, it's almost like a sort of Red Indian character. Do you know what I mean? It's that kind of sort of cowboys and Indians. I don't know. There's something about that, or even like, I don't know, Swallows and Amazons or something like that. But with these stories that are being invented, it made me think as well of the didn't the Bronte sisters as children invent dozens of languages and have these kind of fantasy worlds?
I think they may have done,
inhabited. It sort of made me think of that, and I wonder if that was a deliberate parallel or not. One of the things that struck me about it that's interesting as well is that we see a human, like a half-human character, but sort of ostensibly a human character hunting, which is something that in Star Trek, certainly in Next Gen, I have a feeling even Riker in Next Gen at one point makes some comment about, we don't kill animals for food anymore. And yet, here they are killing those. And I didn't notice it. When they talk about the bunny corn and this poisonous sacs, I imagined the bunny corn as some kind of hideous reptile, and that therefore I sort of didn't mind Kestra. I mean, not that I'm a vegan. I don't, believe in killing any animals, but I sort of reconciled it as it was some dangerous beast that was, a threat to them, and so on, and she was killing it. Then I discover from people who've been, freeze framing the episode, the bunny corn is a cute little bunny. It's a bunny rabbit that she's shot, which is actually in shot in the episode, and is a bunny rabbit with a unicorn's horn, hence a bunny corn, in a nod to the original series episode The Enemy Within, where they have that dog, the dog with the unicorn.
Right, okay.
So anyway, I sort of thought that was a kind of interesting step for Star Trek, that not only have Riker and Troy gone to this world where they're growing their own vegetables and so on, which is kind of a theme we've had in Star Trek before about, it's so much better to grow your own stuff and not have all this replicated stuff and so on, but that they're actually encouraging their children to participate in hunting rather than, I don't know, getting their organic vegetables or whatever it is. They have sort of regressed to a sort of, the wild man of the woods or whatever. Riker's out there, okay, it's a pizza oven, but he's sort of, they're deliberately living a very pre-24th century lifestyle, if you know what I mean. They're kind of shifted into this very old-fashioned gear, I suppose, one way or another.
I think that fits, though, particularly with Will, because he you get when you first see him, there's jazz playing, and you get that he was always interested in he was somebody who had a bit, in a way, this is why, like, Tom Paris is similar to Riker in that they both have 20th century affectations they're interested in. They both have that. They both understand a lot of those cultural reference points. And Will, the fact he's cooking pizza and, he's listening to jazz. He was always a character who had a lot of, fondness for that kind of era and for before. I mean, the fact that they named their son Thaddeus is after the Riker ancestor that we find out about in Death Wish, old Iron Boots from like the Civil War. So again, that's a 19th century, particularly American connection in terms of the Riker history and those kind of cultural reference points that, we were talking in the last episode about how it doesn't seem like lots of people in the future know about Dunkirk. Well, they're certainly not going to know about old Iron Boots, unless they're like Riker, and that's, so I like the fact that I think that's a really good comparison there to draw in terms of the Red Indian stuff. I think there's that he's become
a sort of settler, hasn't he? I suppose it's true. He's a bit of this
on the
pristine,
frontier.
Exactly, on the frontier of this kind of beautiful, unspoilt world. And okay, great. He's not destroying it all. They're kind of living. We get the sense they're living more in harmony with that world. But yeah, I suppose there is that sense that they've come from civilization and they've moved to the wilderness almost.
They are perhaps the one example of where the supposed 24th century utopia that we hoped these characters would get to does exist. And that they've almost reached that, but by doing it, they've gone backwards in a way. Like you say, they've become like futuristic settlers. Yes, they have a house that has like shields, shields up from the Kazinti or whatever, and they can do all those little things. But it does feel like like a homestead on the frontier, out in the wilderness. And that in a way, in itself, is that Star Trek suggesting that, to go forward, you have to go back. And you almost have to sort of regress to this kind of simpler life in order to reach that peace, because it does feel like, and the one thing all through Nepenthe I was desperately hoping they didn't do, and they didn't do it, which is one of the reasons it's my favourite episode of the season, is that I didn't want suddenly a load of Romulans to beam down and start shooting, and, I didn't want that, because I don't want that little corner disrupted. I want them to be happy in that space, so I was over the moon.
Disrupted a pun, Tony.
It should have been. I should have got that. But I didn't want...
Yeah,
I didn't want that.
No, but you're right. We didn't want it spoiled for them. And it's interesting. It's true. It is a form of utopia. And then obviously when we get to the finale, we're going to see a different kind of utopia. And it raises questions about sort of what that kind of utopia might be. And it also, I mean, if you go all the way back to the cage, think of Pike's fantasies in the cage. It was not a million miles away, sitting on a picnic blanket with his girlfriend and a horse. It's kind of... It is almost, that seems to be the fantasy. That's the world that all these people who live in this incredible, wonderful future that, we could only dream of. That's what they want, really. You're right. They want to go back to this kind of, on one level, maybe they do want to go back to this sort of cowboy world somehow.
Wagon train in space.
Wagon train to the stars. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but they have found a kind of peace in this very... old-fashioned world, which is interesting, and they're growing their own vegetables, and we have that conversation between Troy and Soji about the tomatoes and how and she says it's better to be real, basically, and this kind of question of is Soji real or not, and we get that picked up with Picard when he wakes up in his new synth body in the finale. He says, am I real? And she says, of course you are. So she's sort of come on that journey in a sense to recognize that real can mean different things to different people. But Star Trek is always telling us, real alcohol is better than synthahol, real vegetables. I mean, look at Sisko's dad is always going on about how, real ingredients are better than, it's kind of like organic versus, factory farmed in our context almost, isn't it? And they absolutely are living in this environment.
I would have loved to have gone to Joseph Sisko's restaurant. It looked amazing. Mm-hmm. Like, you could almost smell it when it was on the screen.
Another little theme that I suppose, I don't know if it's deliberate, but it might be, is that one of the languages that we hear that Thad invented was a language for butterflies. And there's this discussion where Troy says she could never master it, but it's all about the flapping of their wings and so on. And obviously the butterfly comes to play this sort of symbolic role towards the end, because first of all we've got the butterfly as this sort of emblem of freedom for Picard in the finale, him saying, I wish I could fly away like you, basically. And then for Data, the butterfly represents mortality because it has this very brief lifespan. So I just thought it's an interesting kind of seeding there of this idea of this sort of butterfly motif that's going to run through the season.
That's true. That's I hadn't picked up on that, but yeah, that's a good observation.
My final point for that episode is the admonition is basically a rerun of Terminator 2 Judgment Day. When we see that for the first time, with all this, things exploding and kind of like this vision of horror and chaos and apocalypse, basically.
Are you saying that Agnes Jurati is Sarah Connor? Is that what you're getting at?
Maybe that's where she's going. That would be an interesting... I mean, Sarah Connor wasn't always Sarah Connor, if you know what I mean.
No,
it took her a while to get to that point, didn't it? Who knows? Maybe by season 2 or 3, Agnes is going to be,
maybe
she's going to be ripped and she's going to be gun-toting maniac. I don't know. That would be a surprise. Yeah. But, I like the old Agnes. But, I mean, it's interesting. Maybe, it'd kind of be interesting to see where they do go with her character, because she can't be out of her depth forever, if you know what I mean, which is sort of how she's been played all this season. Okay, well, moving on to Broken Pieces, actually just carrying on with the theme of the admonition, one thing that I thought was interesting about this was that Jurati talks about the admonition as a warning about hubris. And it struck me again, we've been talking about these classical references. We've had hubris quite memorably pointed up in the script for Star Trek Picard in episode 2 with the, famous line from Admiral Clancy. Now we have it coming up in a different context. And I think it's interesting that they should raise this question of hubris. The idea of hubris was originally, I mean, we might think of it in terms of just kind of getting too big for your boots or kind of overreaching or whatever. Originally, I think it carried in that sort of classical context a sort of charge almost of blasphemy. And I suppose, you could say that this idea of creating synthetic beings is almost, from a religious perspective, you might say is blasphemous. This idea that, God creates life, and that for humans to try to create life is sort of presumptuous somehow. But the other thing that struck me about this, the fact that we have this season of Picard which keeps referencing hubris, is that hubris is kind of traditionally paired with Nemesis. Nemesis is the goddess that punishes those who are guilty of hubris. So weirdly, where classically you go from hubris to Nemesis, it kind of feels like, I mean, talking about puns, it feels like a pun on Michael Chabon's part, almost, that they've gone from Nemesis to hubris, and that's what we get with Picard.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that. Yeah, and that, but I think it's the kind of deeper thinking that I think is definitely behind this season and this series. Even if it doesn't always come out in the scripts, even if sometimes things have to be, I really got the sense throughout this entire season that so much was cut and so much was trimmed to, pare it down. And I think Michael Chabon has talked about this, about how, they killed so many of their darlings, so to speak, and that they really pared it down to the bone in terms of what they wanted to get out there. And I dare I say, I think they pared down a bit too much sometimes. Some of these episodes clocked in at like 45 minutes. And I actually wouldn't have minded an hour every week, because I think you could have had the space to actually include a few more scenes that got into the depth, that got into some of this stuff a bit more. And it's one of the reasons I think Broken Pieces on a character level is one of the more successful, because I think, Rios is my favourite character of this new ensemble anyway, but I think the way they approach exploring him in this episode and actually crafting, I know there's other stuff going on and it's a very sort of exposition heavy episode, basically laying out the entire mythology of the season, but ultimately to do that you have to go through this period, this point of understanding Rios's backstory and getting to a little bit more into his character. And I think it was good the way they framed those revelations around Rios was a successful structure. And I think it sometimes I would have liked to have seen that level of depth going into some of these ideas that you've just like the one you just mentioned a little bit more in some of these episodes. Yeah, I really enjoyed all the stuff with Rios. I mean, I loved him as a character anyway, and I think it works well, the revelations that we get in this episode. And also quite dark for Star Trek to have a storyline that features suicide and this kind of, I mean, when he said in that earlier episode he saw his captain's brains splattered across the ship or whatever, I was sort of imagining something like Michael Burnham goes through with her captain, being kind of brutally murdered in front of her. It didn't cross my mind. Although in some ways, with retrospect, you sort of think the way he describes it, you might think that he's talking about a suicide, but it just seems so unlikely in Star Trek that be something that feels again like something that might belong in Battlestar Galactica, not in the Star Trek universe somehow, because it's so antithetical to that whole kind of Federation mindset and so on. But it's interesting, of course, we've had with Rios from early on this kind of
this philosophy book he was reading about the tragic sense of life. I was going to say the pointlessness of life, whatever it is. We saw that in an earlier episode.
Yeah.
This, again, I have to say I'm relying on Wikipedia. This is a book written by a guy called Unamuno, who, this is what Wikipedia has. Life was tragic, according to Unamuno, because of the knowledge that we're to die. He explains much of human activity as an attempt to survive in some form after our death. So again, there's that theme of death and resurrection and kind of, the idea of trying to conquer death or kind of live beyond death or whatever, and the sort of existential crisis of the fact that we're unable to. Now, in Broken Pieces, we see a lot more philosophy books. We see some Camus books. We see various other philosophers. I am going to have to leave it to Metatrex to do an episode on Rios's bookshelf. I mean, we did our episode on Khan's bookshelf in The Wrath of Khan, which I was a bit more familiar with. But interesting, I suppose, that the philosophy... I don't know, that we see this guy who he spends his spare time reading heavy philosophy books in a way that so far in Star Trek we've seen Vulcans doing, maybe, and that's probably just about it. The last time we saw a philosophy book, I think, was Captain Archer being given one by T'Pol and, pretty much giving one look at it and saying, there's no way I'm going to bother reading that. Rios is a captain who is, he's into these sort of deep questions, and he's into them in quite a kind of gritty, serious way, which in some ways you could say, I mean, Picard was into the deep questions, but from a slightly more calm and measured and less tortured perspective.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned Metatrex, because they've done an episode on the philosophical side of this season, and one of the things that Zachary mentions on there is about how they kind of, in his opinion, they didn't quite grasp existentialism. And that they kind of came at it from the angle of that it was an angle that is often approached in that when you think of existentialism these days, it's got I think Zachary's right about this. It's got a very sort of maudlin, somber,
moody teenager sort of
kind of tag.
Yeah. And I'm probably guilty of exactly the same thing in what I've just said. So
but I think it's kind of in popular culture and in culture in general, it's kind of got that reputation in this day and age, heavily I think down to what you've seen in cinema and in film, TV and all this kind of thing, and literature, in that it's kind of got this tag now as being very much about this nihilistic view of existence. And Zachary's approach was that that's not what existentialism is. It's much more about understanding the self in order to live a better life. And he feels like the concept's maybe been a little bit, and I have no massive understanding of this topic, so I defer to him, who clearly does understand it, for more detail on that. But it's interesting that in this season, Rios they definitely approach existentialism in trying to craft Rios as being this very tortured individual, and that he's reading all of these books, like you mentioned, he's reading Kierkegaard, he's reading Camus, he's reading books like the concept of dread, which is all about anxiety and how anxiety is fear and all this kind of stuff. And it's interesting, but it does feel a little bit obvious and on the nose, like with Picard and his interest in philosophy. You really did get the sense that he was just trying to understand ideas about existence to make himself more of an enriched human being, whereas Rios, he seems to be reading these books to try and figure out the answer to why his captain blew his head off, and I think it is a nice parallel in this idea that Rios, in another world or in another way, could have become a Picard himself, I think, in that he's very fond of Picard. He clearly looks up to him. He's clearly a bit of a fanboy, throughout this season in a way, even though he tries to play that down. Picard knows, and Picard can see that he's actually potentially would have been a great Starfleet captain in a different life. So it's interesting that maybe Rios is where, like if Picard after Tapestry had gone down a dark road, when he was full of hubris, as we say back in the day, if he'd become more of a Shinzoni kind of character, would he have ended up more like Rios? Would he have ended up this tortured, angsty individual who was just reading Camus and Kierkegaard, instead of becoming the Picard we know? And so I like the duality of their relationship. I also like the way Rios refers to Picard as quixotic at one point, which, sort of with a bit of a nod to the whole Don Quixote kind of idea, of this. And Picard sort of says, I think he says something like, let's stick to quixotic. I'm happy with that, and go with that.
Well, and he brings it up again to Clancy, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Later on when he has that call with her and he says, the windmills are real, basically, you should have listened to me.
Yeah, he does. Actually.
So yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
But I just like that sense that they are, if not exactly two sides of the same coin, that there is a certain philosophical difference between how these two are played, and that in some senses they could be a similar kind of character. But I would say to anyone, go and listen to that Metatrex, because it does add some interesting ideas to this idea of Rios and what he's reading.
I should say, obviously, the windmills are real in Don Quixote. I mean, the monsters, or whatever it is, I can't remember. What is it? He thinks they are giants. The giants are real.
Yeah.
Because saying the windmills are real is, that's my lockdown brain and or his Iremodic syndrome
I know what you mean.
coming through, but probably the former. But yeah. But interesting that Don Quixote gets these kind of very glancing references, which I suppose makes a lot of sense for Picard as a character. I mean, we talked last time about the parallels between Picard on the Vineyard and Sherlock Holmes in retirement, keeping bees and so on. But again, Don Quixote is a sort of obvious character for this guy who wants to go back out, go out questing essentially at an advanced age, and possibly having lost at least some of his marbles. And I don't feel the show ever quite. They don't lay it on very thick. It's not like, in First Contact, Picard is Captain Ahab. Okay, maybe here Picard is Don Quixote, but they certainly don't lay it on with the same...
With a trowel.
With a trowel, exactly, in this instance. But it's an interesting parallel to think about again.
Yeah. No, it is, yeah.
Anything else for you from Broken Pieces that jumps out?
I suppose that there is another sort of shade to Rios. He's listening to Billie Holiday and a song... called Solitude.
On his Walkman.
Yeah, on his Walkman.
I love that line, actually. The first time I watched it, I was just slightly baffled, but then once I understood the joke, I thought it was brilliant.
Yeah. And I suppose that's another example of how the show is tapping into cultural reference points we understand. At one point as well, he orders a cup of peppermint ice cream and a plate of French fries for Soji, So, and these are, I can't... But back in the Next Generation era, you did have that happen at times, but it felt like it would often be more either alien beverages or sort of human beverages of the era a little bit more, or if it was deliberately old fashioned, it would be something like root beer, or I don't know, something particular. I just feel like there's quite a lot of particular reference points to an earlier time. Things like the Spanish lullaby that he sings as well, Arroz con leche. I can't exactly how you say it, but it feels like with Rios, he is a bit of a lightning rod, maybe in a similar sense to how Riker was in TNG for these older reference points. Maybe because but then I was going to say maybe because he's one of those characters who feels more organically like somebody who would be living in the past. But then I think you could say the same about Raffi, and so they are all characters who've been devised to be far more contemporary to 21st century existence than the Next Generation characters were. It's in the DNA of Picard that these are people that could exist today. They just happen to be existing in 2399. So I don't know.
Yeah, well, I suppose Star Trek has always had this interest in popular culture one way or another. You've got Riker's Jazz, you've got Tom Paris on Voyager, I suppose, certainly bringing it up. I think what strikes me about Rios is pretty cool. Riker was pretty cool, I suppose, in some ways. Tom Paris on Voyager, it was cheesy. Do you know what I mean? The pop culture that he was resurrecting, it was naff, it was a bit ropey. It was ironic, I suppose, the thing. And maybe this was the 90s. It was the kind of ironic 90s. Rios now, okay, so you could say he's a little bit of a caricature of a sort of moody, teenager reading books of French existentialism or whatever, and smoking and, drinking and, who knows what else. But he's definitely a cool character. And partly that's the guy who plays him just seems impossibly cool and also incredibly talented and, all the rest. But the fact that he's playing Billie Holiday, it gives him credibility somehow. Do you know what I mean? In a way that I think certainly someone like Tom Paris, with his own interest in previous popular culture, lacks somehow. It kind of you can sort of imagine that Billie Holiday is something that's going to survive for 400 years or whatever. We can only hope.
Well, I think I'd imagine her music would, yeah. So it's those kind of, I don't mind Star Trek pulling out those kind of, because I mean, Mozart and Beethoven are listened to today, so I don't see why someone like Billie Holiday wouldn't be in the future. Definitely, it's when you start getting people like, I don't know, Girls Aloud, or Ricky Martin.
I was going to say, yeah. But you mentioned the Beatles earlier. I suspect we're never going to see Beatles or hear Beatles music on Star Trek because outside of The Prisoner, that I think that's kind of prohibitively expensive, right? But,
yeah.
And maybe they tried that once and got burnt. But Billie Holiday, absolutely. Obviously we've had the Beastie Boys, so who knows what else? Yeah. The whole
whatever they
gamut
can get
of musical culture.
Whatever doesn't
there.
Cost a lot.
I know. Yeah. One for melodic tracks there, really, I think. Shall we move on now then and talk about the finale, the 2-part finale? I think we'll treat that as one episode because I can't even remember what happens in which part, to be perfectly honest. Now, one thing that struck me, I think we'll come on to talk about the title in a minute, but I did look up also the name of the planet. So the name Coppelius apparently is taken from a German short story, The Sandman, which is about an automaton, or in some ways refers to an automaton, and I didn't go around to reading it. I'm sorry, but I don't know if you know anything more about this story or whether tell us on the Babel conference that we missed a trick in the research here. But it may be just a passing reference. But anyway, it is another planet that is named for something significant and relevant to the plot rather than just, whatever it is, X, Y, Z, 1, 2, 3, in the kind of sci-fi way. The big thing here, I think, is this idea of Arcadia. And we've got it in the title Et in Arcadia Ego. Okay, first of all, it refers to the idea of Arcadia. Arcadia being this kind of classical vision of a sort of pastoral utopia, in effect. Very much like, as you say, Nepenthe is in actuality. Arcadia was a province that was a mountainous province. It became this kind of byword for, I suppose, this simpler life, this kind of lost, simpler. There's a sort of a parallel, I think, with the Garden of Eden, the idea of this kind of perfect, innocent life that has been lost almost to some extent. And obviously with the synths growing up in this sort of new world, this new community, there is almost a sense of that synth feel there is a kind of Edenic environment somehow where these, brilliant creators are making life out of nothing. So there's kind of an element there. Virgil set his eclogues, if that's how you pronounce that word, in Arcadia. But the title refers specifically to a painting. This is a painting by Nicolas Poussin. And the title, it means, Et in Arcadia Ego, basically means even in Arcadia, in paradise, here I am, I exist. And the painting is a picture of a tomb. And so the assumption of most people, the kind of general gloss on this, is that the person speaking, the title of the painting is death. And it's basically saying, even in paradise, we're all mortal. We're still going to die. So again, there's that kind of theme of mortality, of, for Picard, the kind of impending death and the tomb and so on. For Data, as it turns out at the end of the episode, we've got this kind of theme of death. This idea of kind of death is going to get us all one way or another. We're only mortal, as Picard tells Riker in Star Trek Generations, not realising that he himself is going to prove otherwise.
Yeah, it's fascinating that it's a definite, very clear reference point that, I mean, people who understand art will almost certainly immediately pick it up, as opposed to people who have to go and research it. But I think Arcadia is definitely a term that's been used before. I mean, there's an episode of the TV show Millennium from the 90s called In Arcadia Ego, which is playing again on a similar reference point, I think. So it definitely has existed before in certain TV shows and things like that. But I think I do think the whole idea here of this being a utopia makes sense in the context of that the entire season of Picard has sort of suggested that utopia doesn't exist at this point now, that what we thought, like I said before, the utopia that we thought we were going to get in the 24th century hasn't materialized. But then they come across this planet, this Eden, in theory, yet it's compromised, yet it's potentially going to be the gateway to some dark, and maybe we'll talk about this a bit later.
A dark serpent. There's always a serpent in the Garden of Eden, isn't there? And these ones are literally coming out of the sky.
Like a dark Lovecraftian serpent god that is potentially going to come out and get them. So I think it's like a tainted utopia. You know, if the Troy Rikers are living in a proper utopia, a peaceful existence, these guys are living in a fake. And it's one of those that soon it's a corrupted Eden, I think. And that's why I suppose, you know, you've got these characters who then are theoretically supposed to be part of this sort of Edenic idea, but become, you know, are compromised, like Sutra. You know, like, he's a great example of that kind of character who at first might appear serene and charming and seductive. I mean, her very name, for me, is a nod to the Kama Sutra. You know, this idea, you know, the famous, for want of a better term, sort of sex manual from, you know, years gone by, that is all about, you know, love and sexuality and that kind of thing. And she is very seductive, but she is ultimately, even though it's not really paid off that much, she is essentially a bad guy. So I do like the idea that they reach a fallen utopia by the end. I think that is a good payoff for what we've had before.
She is almost a kind of a sort of Lucifer figure or something. There is, she's the kind of, I mean, she's Law Mark II to some extent, but she is also, you're right, she's the kind of the snake in the garden, if you know what I mean. And she's the one who's going to release these, as you say, these kind of Lovecraftian techno snake eel monster things, which are a bizarre, I don't know about you, I found them a slightly bizarre introduction into Star Trek. I mean, even just having heard about these kind of advanced synths and what were we expecting to come from the future, they're very similar actually to what came from Discovery. We had that thing with sort of tentacles and so on. I mean, where this idea, well, you know, maybe it does come from Lovecraft, but, you know, it feels slightly out of keeping with the Star Trek universe for me. I don't know, what's your take on those monsters, and whether they sort of fit or not?
I don't know. I mean, I liked it because I think it was peculiar, and I think it's sort of tapping into, there's been a real resurgence for Lovecraftian fiction in the last few years, and it's all over the place, you know, from everything from the fact we're now getting fairly big budget literal Lovecraft adaptations like The Colour Out of Space, which was fairly successful recently and is going to spark a trilogy, you know, up to the fact that you get things like there's a new film out called Underwater with Kristen Stewart, which actually has a Lovecraft reference in it towards the end. And even just generally in lots and lots of fictional universes now, they seem to be tapping into the idea that Lovecraft he's one of my favourite writers, and he's been an influence on everything over the last 100 years, from Stephen King through to a lot of the movies you will have watched, you know, as fans of this kind of stuff. And he ultimately was, his work is pretty terrifying. It was written in like the 20s and 30s and a time like that. And he was writing about an unknowable cosmic universe, and that we were a tiny little speck, and we meant nothing. He was a very him and Rios would have got on great, because he was a very nihilistic kind of writer. And he was very much all about how humanity cannot look upon my works, ye mighty, and despair. What's that quote? You know, it's that whole idea of looking up at the cosmos and being so unable to fathom what is out there that you go mad. And most of the characters in Lovecraft stories lose their minds because they glimpse something that is beyond comprehension. And I suppose that's
Auntie Ramda here then.
Yeah. And I think in some senses the closest that Star Trek came to that before, even though it wasn't presented in this way, was probably the Borg. In that you were thrown into an alien species that was completely unlike anything that they'd ever encountered in Star Trek before. You know, it didn't have any comprehensible, you know, it wasn't a race with a culture in the sense of it has a planet, it has a foundational government, you can negotiate with them. You know, they were a force to, you know, just powering through the galaxy. But ultimately the Borg were not completely unknowable. They were a collective of assimilated beings, and you could get your head around the Borg Queen and what they were trying to do. Lovecraft and these synths from wherever are that idea of the old, what Lovecraft would describe as the old gods. These completely which is why you don't really ever see it properly. You only see the tentacle snake through, because you can't ultimately. I don't think you would ever see all of it, because you couldn't. It's beyond comprehension. It's from somewhere in the universe that Star Trek will never go because the whole point is that you can't look upon it because the characters would not understand it. And I think that's why I liked it, because it's scary and it's something that is in fitting with maybe this idea that, the universe of the late 24th century is a bit ragged and a bit more lawless and a bit more unknowable again. And in some sense, I quite like that about what they've done with Picard. Even if I don't always love some of the choices that have been made, I like the idea that maybe now the neutral zone has collapsed and that the Borg aren't quite the threat that they were. We don't know what's out there. And you only have to shoot a laser up into the sky and you could have some sort of all-destroying hell beast come out of a portal. So but I'm a big fan of Lovecraft, so maybe that's swaying my opinion.
Well, maybe if I was more familiar with Lovecraft's works, then these monsters would appeal to me a little bit more as well. I mean, I don't mind them. I just sort of feel like they don't, to me, sell this kind of advanced civilization that that's been built up somehow. They feel very different to they're not what I was expecting, I suppose. Let's put it that way. But ultimately, I guess we're not going to see much of them, whatever they are. So, if they work for you, then good for you.
Yeah. And that's the thing, they won't work for everyone because they maybe aren't particularly Star Trek, but in some sense, like I say, I think that's kind of the point.
Fair enough. Well, just going back to the idea of Arcadia before we move on, I mean, so we talked a little bit about the idea of Arcadia as this kind of Edenic environment. Sutra, obviously, I mean, Sutra, we talked about her as this kind of serpent figure. She, at one point, it sort of feels almost like she's running a death cult or something. There's this sort of element of, who's drinking Sutra's Kool-Aid here and people, the fact that and Picard talks about them as being very inexperienced and kind of giving into fear and kind of needing to be set a good example and all these kind of things. It just sort of feel like there's this idea of there's always this sort of thing, isn't there, about like, how the crowd behaves in a certain situation. We have Picard trying to make his big rallying speech at the end of part 1 of this finale and then finding that it doesn't land at all. He seems to have completely lost the ability to carry the room somehow. And Sung is the one who sort of says, yeah, they're not going to buy any of that. That's all a load of, and says to them, don't listen to this. This is all rubbish, essentially. So there is this kind of sense, this slightly cult-like element of like, who's going to make the appeal to reason, who's going to sort of get this group to go in the right direction. And ultimately, Picard has to find a different way of doing that. Before we kind of move on from this idea of Arcadia, I just wanted to raise another possibility, which I think is... When this first crossed my mind, I thought this was a bit of a stretch, even more than my Dixon Hill idea in the previous episode. But that is the idea that this episode is not just influenced by the painting Et in Arcadia Ego, but that it may actually also be influenced by the Tom Stoppard play Arcadia, which was originally written under a working title of Et in Arcadia Ego, and which features a discussion of the painting and a double gloss on what that title means, because it has one character who sort of mistranslates, a lot of the play is sort of about translation and about these kind of classical texts and so on, mistranslates it as here I am in Arcadia, and the daughter says actually it's something more like even in Arcadia here am I, or something like that. Anyway, so there's this discussion about sort of what does this phrase exactly mean. Now you might think it's a bit of an obscure one, that this play by an English dramatist, which is about, for anyone who's not familiar with it, it's a brilliant play. It's absolute, I would say, Stoppard's best play for my money. Real theatrical masterpiece, but it's set in this English country house in 2 time periods, and it's kind of, I would say, it's written before that idea of these kind of 2 time period narratives became so sort of hackneyed and predictable and boring. But basically in the one time period, it's in the time of Byron, and there's this group of people at this country house, including this young girl who is a bit of a prodigy, and her tutor is an old friend of Byron's, and Byron may or may not be staying with them, although we never see him on stage, but we understand that he is there. He is visiting the family at the time, sort of on the estate. And then in the latter period, set in the present day, as it was then, now, set in the, whatever it is, early 90s or something, when the play was written, there's a Byron scholar kind of investigating and trying to piece together these different elements of what's happened and work out. He becomes convinced that Byron fought a duel. Now, in fact, there was a proposed duel, but it was someone else. And so there's a lot of comedy around the modern characters misunderstanding what's going on in the past. But there's also a kind of tragic element because there's this whole thing going on about what Arcadia is and what it represents, because what's going on at the time in the earlier time period is that they're ripping up their sort of classical landscape architecture and replacing it with this sort of mock Gothic architecture instead, almost like those Lovecraftian eels coming through the sky. You know, they're kind of throwing out the classical trappings. They're getting rid of the beautiful, sort of old-fashioned decorations and ornaments in their garden and so on. And I should say, actually, I mean, you know, even in talking about this classical thing, the way those androids are dressed, it does feel very kind of like they're living in the classical world somehow, something about their clothing and so on. So I think there is that illusion there. But the other thing that is interesting to me about the possibility that there are links between these two storylines is, you talked about this idea of the sort of truth that drives people mad. Well, the character of the tutor in Arcadia, we understand, is driven mad. He gets to the point where he becomes a hermit, supposedly, or maybe he doesn't. They build this kind of hermitage, which is like a fake bit of landscape architecture. And then there's this question of who's going to live in the hermitage. And it turns out that he essentially goes mad and goes to live in the hermitage. Well, obviously, we've had Picard earlier on in the series described as the hermit of La Barre. So there's a kind of connection there. We've got a hermit in both stories who's one who's been driven to that by personal tragedy. Now, in the case of Septimus, the tutor in Arcadia, it's the death of this young girl who he's teaching, who he's also slightly, well, she's certainly fallen in love with him, and there's an element of kind of romantic attachment between the two of them. And she dies tragically on the eve of, I think, her 17th birthday, so very young, kind of, I suppose, enacting this idea that even in paradise, death still waits for everyone, you know. So she's this kind of young girl who's died. But the other key strand of the play really is this interest in chaos theory and fractal equations and iterations, and the idea that nature can be understood through this kind of new form of maths. And the idea that the play puts forward is that this girl basically made this discovery effectively, you know, many hundreds of years before anyone else did, but it was lost. Her kind of her brilliant insight was lost because she happened to die. But so the play is all about, you know, whether you can understand nature through studying maths and so on. And this idea of a fractal being something where the whole is kind of a multiplication of the part, of course, is absolutely key to Picard, because how do we get this whole generation of synths? We get it through fractal neuronic cloning, where basically one tiny piece of data is used to create this whole community of androids. So I don't know, maybe it's a bit of a stretch. On the other hand, it crossed my mind, Michael Chabon may well have seen the play Arcadia, and it may have stuck in his head one way or another. And it is, as I would say, an absolutely fabulous play. If you can go and see it, go and see it. If you can't, go and read it. Don't listen to the version on Audible, which I made the mistake of doing to refresh my memory this week, because it's maybe if you're an American listener, it might not bother you, but this is a play set in an English country house, and the version that's available on Audible is an American theatre company doing a production of it, which they, you know, the performances are fine, but the accents are terrible. So I would not recommend that one.
Is it a bit Keanu Reeves in Dracula going on?
Slightly.
Is it a bit like
it's
that?
hit and miss. So some of them actually, it's mostly hit, but it's just the odd word that kind of really jumps out. But others, it just feels wrong. It feels. I've seen many productions of this play, some better than others, and it has always, you know, completely floored me with the brilliance of the play. This version, I think, the performers slightly got in the way of the play to some extent, so I wouldn't particularly recommend it. But it is a very interesting play. Whether that's a bit of a stretch to say it's an influence on Picard, I don't know. But there are these strange thematic resonances between the two that made me think that is actually more than just a tiny possibility.
Well, it being someone like Michael Chabon, like you say, it wouldn't surprise me. You know, I can see that as a strong possibility. It does sound really interesting. I didn't know anything about that, so I will look that up if I can. And I think there are definite, like the whole idea of the positronic neuron, for me, that's a little bit also a bit like the spark of life, the spark of God, essentially. You know, I think to the the famous painting on the Sistine Chapel, you know, of the two fingers meeting. I can't remember. I've been to the Sistine Chapel, but I can't remember the name of that painting. The Creation of Adam, maybe, I think it is, by
which we get in Discovery, essentially, in the credits of Discovery, though not Picard, interestingly. Yeah.
But it all goes back to that similar idea of this data almost. Now, one thing that I think I mentioned this on my other podcast and make it so, that data, for a lot of this, up maybe until the final scene, he's heavily mythologized for me in this season. You know, he becomes a mythical figure. You know, there are references, you know, whether it's Kestra remembering the adventures on the Enterprise and all the things that Data liked, and he's like a mythical character for her now because she never met him and he died years ago. You know, to the point that Picard remembers him to Soji and Darge and all these kind of things. He is a mythical being almost, and he does the idea that part of data is used to spark life and create and set this whole thing in motion essentially is fascinating, because it takes a character who by the end is very recognizably the android we know when he has that sequence with Picard, but up until that point it's like he is almost like a synthetic higher being who they use the power of, and they use the mind of, and they use the spirit of, if you want to get into that kind of idea, to create life. And I think that happening in this, you know, vision of Arcadia, this flawed utopia, where, like you say, everyone, they do dress like they're in the classical world. I thought at the time it looked like a planet that Kirk, Spock and McCoy would have beamed down to, you know, in the original series, you know, and found them all in garb and that kind of thing, a classical garb, like ancient Greece. And I think that's all very intentional, you know, in that it's trying to suggest that, you know, this is a place where life is being created. And I mean, I suppose as well that ties into the idea of the golem, doesn't it? And Picard's fate ultimately. But there are interesting ideas going on with all of this.
Well, I think the golem is the other big interesting idea, as you say, that gets put in there. Now, one of the things that struck me, obviously, Michael Chabon is a Jewish writer, very interesting kind of Jewish culture and themes and so on. And so I believe is his wife, who actually has a story credit on part one of this double episode. Now, I don't know whether that means, did they bash out the story together? Did she contribute? Often that means that someone contributed some quite key element to the story. So it crossed my mind that could, you know, maybe she brought in the golem, who knows? But bringing a golem into Star Trek, I mean, calling it a golem is quite a bold move, because a golem is a kind of concept in sort of this ancient mystical Jewish sort of folklore. I think it's Kabbalah really, rather than kind of more official Judaism, if you know what I mean. It's sort of slightly the dark arts side of all that. There's an episode of The X-Files that features a golem, yeah. I believe.
Kaddish.
Is that right, Tony?
Kaddish.
Yeah.
Season 4, episode 15.
There you go. And very interestingly, Michael Chabon, in his book Maps and Legends, which is an interesting book of essays, and obviously gives the episode Maps and Legends its title, writes a whole essay about golems. It's called something like Golems I Have Known, which he represents as a piece of autobiography, but then at the end basically concedes is entirely, or at least maybe not entirely, but largely made up and essentially a work of fiction. But he talks about this idea that his uncle, I think, was crafting a golem in the basement of his house at one point, and he, Michael Chabon, was convinced he'd brought it to life. But there's this idea of, you know, the sort of magical spark that brings this, it's kind of Frankenstein, basically brings this dead thing to life, which obviously is a big theme for the show generally. But what Chabon said, which I thought was interesting, was that the act of creating a golem for these sort of Jewish mystics or whatever, it wasn't really about doing magic and creating this entity that you know walked around and lived like a kind of a Frankenstein or whatever. It was a sort of, he describes it as an exercise in imagination. Now, imagination is key to the resolution of this storyline. You know, you've got Picard telling Soji she lacks imagination. They've got this magical tool that uses imagination to kind of fix all the narrative problems the episode has got into. Now, Chabon is basically saying that the act of creating this body, even knowing that the magic won't work, is somehow a creative act in its own right, because, and he describes it as being effectively like God sculpting Adam in the Garden of Eden, essentially. Again, you know, so again, we're kind of brought back to that idea of Eden. And it just strikes me, I mean, not only, obviously it's key to Star Trek, this idea of creating a new life form. I mean, we've had, Data was a new life form. We had Picard saying, now we've got a new generation of new life forms. So there's this kind of theme of the creation of new, in terms of sort of the history of human culture in a sense. So you've got this classical illusion, you've got going back to ancient Greece and so on. You've got this sort of idea of the Garden of Eden, of Genesis, of the creation of Adam and so on. And then in the resurrection of Picard, you've got, I mean, we started this conversation on Easter Sunday. You've got this Christ-like image, basically, of the man who dies and goes away for a while and then comes back resurrected. So it's almost like you've got these 3 points in human civilization somehow that are all being referenced, almost layered on top of each other somehow.
Yeah, yeah, multiple references, and I think that's why it ultimately is quite. Again, it's another one of those episodes, I think, that has a lot of interesting ideas that fall prey to the fact there's a lot going on. And I don't know if you can really get into a lot of the detail with them, to be honest. I mean, I found the like you say, the reference to the golem particularly surprising in terms of it, you know, that exact word, because I think that is very specific. And it brings about a lot of illusions, you know, it brings it, and I think because the idea of part of the idea of the golem particularly is that it's a representation of someone. I mean, in that X-Files episode you mentioned, the golem is a husband who's killed and he's resurrected, but he doesn't really have his soul anymore. He's kind of just walking around with the body of this Jewish man, but he's disconnected from the world. And I think that's to then put Picard in that, but not follow that through is interesting, because the suggestion at the end is that he's still, and it's caused a lot of questions, hasn't it? This immediately amongst fan circles, is it still Picard? I mean, there's even a debate going on about whether or not Picard now should have a separate memory alpha page for Golem Picard, you know?
Yeah.
And there's a big debate going on about that. And it's a bit like, well, you know, it's getting into some real metaphysical, philosophical questions about whether this is the same man, even though the episode for me wants you to believe it is. The episode for me is just saying his old body was worn out. He's got a new one. Don't worry about it. Same guy. Don't worry about it. It's just the same as if he transported down to a planet. His molecules are taken apart and he's put back together again. So I think a lot of this, what you believe in terms of this, depends on your stance from a philosophical point of view, actually, which is interesting.
Well, also, someone raised the practical question, what did they do with Picard's body?
Yeah,
because it's not like when you get beamed somewhere and the old one disappears and the new one arrives in its place. And obviously, we know with Thomas Reich, you end up with 2 and there's kind of chaos. But, you know, the Picard that died had a body that, you know, decayed. And did they bury it? You know what? I mean, that's a kind of sort of lingering question. Picard, when he wakes up in his golem body, might want to know, you know, what happened to the old body. But it's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think the golems traditionally... Well, I don't know. My understanding was a golem is not a vessel to put an existing consciousness or katra or whatever you want to call it into. It is more like a sort of fairly basic sort of robotic thing that you create. And often in these stories about golems, they go wrong and they cause trouble and they have to be, you know, sort of put back in the box one way or another. But it does sort of feel like we go from the golem story, the sort of, you know, Jewish story, or, you know, in a sense, the Old Testament story, to the New Testament story that we get at the end, where Picard is just sort of magically resurrected. And obviously we've had that in Star Trek before. I mean, we had that with Spock. The weird thing is we thought we were going to get it with Data. You know, the end of Nemesis leaves open the idea that Data is going to be resurrected in a new body. And then in fact, what this whole season sort of leads up to is a kind of bait and switch, where we almost think that I almost thought we were going to get Data back at the end of this season, to be honest, because they talked about him so much that they would finally find a way to bring him back to life. Then we get Data finally being, you know, switched off eventually, and Picard being brought back in a new body, weirdly, which is not something I think anyone saw coming. So it's this weird, there's something very strange about that decision, because it absolutely, you're sort of wrong-footed as an audience, and have been for 20 odd years in a way, in terms of what to expect. But instead we get Picard sort of doing a Spock basically and coming back from the dead. And Nicholas Meyer famously refused to do, I mean, he talked to me about this on the podcast a few weeks ago, refused to do Star Trek 3 because he said, I can't do resurrection. I don't believe in that. I'm not, you know, I can't work on that story, basically. It's meaningless to me. Now, obviously, we got Spock back, and that was great, and he went on to have various other adventures. You know, and he was sort of doing the same thing again, and I don't know whether... Seriously, I'm curious. I mean, Maya was saying, you know, Maya, also a Jewish writer, I think an atheist Jew, as I imagine Michael Chabon probably is, I'm curious, does the idea of resurrection... I don't really have a problem with them bringing back Spock or with them bringing back... I'm glad they didn't kill off Picard for a start, because I'm looking forward to next season and so on. But it does make me wonder, for example, does someone with a Christian faith view the resurrection of a character like Picard differently than someone who does? Do you know what I mean? Does it make a difference if you actually believe that's possible? Because for me, there is a slight sticking point that, okay, there are lots of things in Star Trek that I know aren't possible, but this is one big thing to add to the list of things that I don't believe are possible that is possible. Do you know what I mean? And it's sort of, if you're primed to think that that's actually happened anyway, then maybe that affects how you read a story like that. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I don't have any religious faith myself, so I don't really hold a lot of stock in those ideas. But it didn't feel like a resurrection story in a way to me. It felt like it just happened to be I suppose, for want of a better term, and maybe this is a pun, a deus ex machina in order to kind of pay off the story that feels like they did too early. I mean, I almost feel like they pulled the trigger on Picard's health too soon here, that they could have saved this till the final season and had a really affecting, sad moment where these characters he spent 3 or 4 seasons with gather round and he does actually die, and he has, because, logically, I think ultimately you may want to end Picard whenever it ends with Picard's death, potentially. I think it feels like, we've not had this happen to a captain since Kirk, and Kirk's death famously was misjudged big time. And if they could see their time over again, I think that would have been done very, very differently. So Picard's death logically is the next step. So to actually do it here, and then have him come back without it being like Spock, with Spock, he dies to save the ship, and then he does go through a process where he is literally almost sort of reborn through like a quasi sort of biblical story. Whereas Picard, it feels like he's just transferred. It feels like he's just uploaded into a system and then put into another body. That's not resurrection to me. That feels like just a get out. That just feels like a way of them trying to pay off an emotional beat, but then have their cake and eat it almost, and find a way to resolve the real death, which is obviously Data, and resolve what, again, was probably a bit of a misjudged story at the end of Nemesis. That was an attempt to reimagine what happens to Spock. That whole film is just trying to copy the Wrath of Khan, let's face it. And it doesn't hold the same power, at all. When Data just blows up, that, and transports Picard away, it's meant to be a shock, sudden thing, and it is, but it just doesn't feel. It felt wrong then. I think I always felt like it just felt like. It just didn't work for me, and I think a lot of people have felt that way, and this was an attempt to try and reconcile that and give Data a proper send off. But then it feels like it, like I say, it feels like it wants to have its cake and eat it with what happens to Picard, and I don't have a problem with it at all. I mean, I don't find this difficult now that he's in another body. So what? I can write it off just the same way that they put Professor X into another body in the X-Men films, when he dematerializes or whatever, which is, another strange Patrick Stewart parallel. But ultimately, I wonder what the point of this whole story was for Picard, if you're just not going to really have him die, actually die at the point it feels logical for that to happen.
I agree, and it feels oddly as if someone changed their mind somewhere along the way. But they are absolutely insistent. I mean, I've seen Akiva Goldsman sort of swearing blind that this is not the case, that this was always the intention, was to take him on this journey, touch on his mortality, and then give him a new lease of life, effectively. And I suppose it is kind of seeded, this idea of resurrection. Even in a very early episode, I noticed on a rewatch, Narek says to Soji about, the reasons that people are working. They have this conversation about why people would come to the Borg Cube. And he says the Borg Cube is a graveyard and people come for different reasons. Some of them are basically there as grave robbers. He says she's working there because she pins her hopes on resurrection. This idea that those who are lost or who are dead can be kind of revived somehow. And arguably that is, the Borg, again, you've got this kind of Frankenstein thing. You've got kind of life from beyond, where life seemed to be possible. A lot of people have said they thought the Borg in this season seemed a bit random or a bit sort of underused, but in some ways there is a parallel. They're not being paralleled so much with the synths, but the golem is not a million miles away from a Borg. There are these kind of loose parallels, at least, or these kind of echoes between different elements of the story.
Yeah. I suppose that's true. It is seeded in the idea of rebirth. I think on a thematic level, I understand why it's done in that sense. That it is about Picard finding that sense of life again. I get that, but I don't know if it needs to be literalized. For me, I don't know if he literally needed to get a new body and get rid of the Euromodic syndrome or whatever it was, and off he goes for another 10, 20 years. But, that's more of a personal sort of...
It's not the ending of the season that I was expecting at all. But I think I am managing to reconcile myself to it. I do at least think it's interesting. They didn't go an obvious route. They took some slightly strange decisions. And in a way, I applaud them for that. And I am curious to see, where this takes us in season 2. And who knows, in a year or two's time, maybe we'll be sitting down. Look, we've hit about 2 hours again today, and wrapping our heads around season 2 of Picard and seeing, how many hours of discussion we can get out of it.
I think we will.
Well, before we go, Tony, is there anything else you wanted to flag up about these final couple of episodes? Anything else that jumped out at you?
Well, one tiny thing and then one other little thing. Picard using Shakespeare was quite nice when he's saying goodbye to Data in that final scene. And I suppose the whole, rebirth thing, he's worth it for that final 20 minutes, like you say. It was unorthodox, but it was really nicely done, I think. So him using that, saying the Shakespeare quote, "We are such stuff as dreams are made on," he's lovely, for various meta reasons about Patrick Stewart and his Shakespearean background as well. So that was nice. The other one was that the mention of that when Narek, and I mentioned it earlier, when Narek's telling the story of the Romulan myth, he mentions Ganmadan, which is their version of the Romulan version of essentially like Judgment Day, the apocalypse, or Ragnarok, if you go into sort of Norse myth and things like that. I thought that was interesting, that there is maybe a shared sort of intergalactic idea of all races having their apocalypse moment, of having their myth in their culture, that there will be an event someday that is equivalent to what we know in our, historical, and a lot of Earth-based cultures and religions all have different versions of that myth. So it's interesting that that's across the galaxy potentially as well,
and that we've kind of gone from Genesis and the Garden of Eden through to Apocalypse in the space of one episode, basically. Yeah. Well, that's an interesting point, and definitely another big theme underlying the series. The other thing, of course, in the finale that struck me is that we've got Brent Spiner again playing, not just playing another Sung, but playing a character not too dissimilar from the one he played on Enterprise. This kind of mad scientist with a group of super-powered, slightly scary, slightly sketchy children who he may or may not be able to control. There's definitely a kind of riff on that storyline going on here.
Yeah, that's Brent Spiner's stuck in trade now. At least he's not a bad guy in a way, sort of in this. Sort of is, sort of isn't.
I quite liked that. I know some people were expecting him to turn out to be a real villain, but I quite liked the fact that he was just, I don't know, he seemed like a basically decent guy, didn't he? Although I suppose he was willing to go along with the plot to eradicate all organic life in the galaxy. So maybe we're being a bit generous to him there.
Yeah, we're being
by the end of part 2, all of that is forgiven because he switched sides, and we're kind of able to sort of sit around and laugh and joke with him. But I don't know. Yeah. Maybe sketchier than he seems. He seemed the most Brent Spiner of all Brent Spiner's characters on Star Trek somehow. It felt to me the closest to home somehow.
That's true.
Anyway, it's been a pleasure talking about season 1 of Star Trek Picard this episode, as indeed it was last episode. But that's not all we've been talking about on Trek FM this week. So have a listen at what else you might have missed out on the network.
Previously on Trek.fm, The Orb.
But of all the Section 31 that we're getting in New Trek, this feels the most legitimate. This feels like the Section 31 that we know from Deep Space Nine, and it doesn't feel like, we're just going back to the well again, because, even Ira said, I know they've used it in the movies, but we created this.
Earl Grey.
Still no clue. I'm going to kick myself when I get it.
Yeah, tell us, Jim.
Kirsten Dunst.
Oh my gosh, of course!
I hate the universe.
My gosh, I knew that. What's wrong with us?
The best Loaxana performance in all 7 seasons, in my opinion.
Literary Treks.
If this were an episode of Voyager, and I actually think this book would make an interesting episode of Voyager, and like we kind of hinted at, maybe it's very much like an episode of Voyager that we'll talk about. I don't think it would have been called 7 of 9, right?
No, it would have to have like a one-word title to fit in with most of the other Voyager episodes, so you can't really remember which one it's about.
Yeah, it would just be called 7. That's what it would be.
To the journey!
She did actually mean what she said back in the space just before they die. I don't know, I just kind of like it. It's just
I'm going to tell you I love you just before I die. Not a minute sooner.
It's like, at least I don't have to deal with the ramifications if I'm dead. Well, that backfired.
Or maybe she was just like, at least I don't have to hear him not say it if we're going to die.
So what you're saying is next time that we ask someone to marry them, or anyone who asks someone to marry them, they should do it on death's door of like some kind of crazy adventure. Like jumping off a bungee jump.
Yes, you're in the middle of being eaten by a shark or something.
I love you! Gobble, gobble, gobble.
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
Check out all these shows and join the conversation about your favourite corner of the Star Trek universe and beyond. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. If you're an Apple user, be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on iPhone, iPad, or Apple TV, or the desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they're published. And please leave us a star rating and a written review. If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, in most third-party apps, and you can stream and download the MP3 file from our website or grab the RSS link. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's show, and there are many ways for you to do that. The best place to join in the larger conversation is the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type Babel, B-A-B-E-L, into the search field on Facebook and it should come right up. If you'd like to send us an email, you can use the form on our website at trek.fm/contact. Choose to send to a show and select Primitive Culture, and that will come right to us. You can also find the network on Twitter at TrekFM and on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. If you'd like to help us keep all our shows coming to you each week, you can become a patron of the network on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/TrekFM. That's patreon.com/TrekFM to get all the details. Perks include early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and more, available through our special patrons website, Patron Zone. It requires a great deal of money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month, so we really appreciate any support you can give us, and we hope you'll join the team. Again, you can find all our details at patreon.com/TrekFM. We'd like to take a moment now to thank our associate producers on Primitive Culture, Amy Nelson, Clara Cook, and Tony Black. Amy is a presenter of many other shows on the network, and you can find her on Twitter at Miss Amy Nelson. Clara and Tony were two of the former co-hosts of this show, and they'll be popping back from time to time. You can find Clara on Twitter at ClaraJeanMC, and Tony at AJ Black Writer.
You're blended all right.